Hello, everyone. I'm Bradley Barth, Senior Reporter with SC Media, and I'll be your moderator for the next half hour. Welcome to today's webcast, Closing the Gap, Enabling a Cloud Security Strategy in an Uncertain Business Climate, sponsored by JSonar. At some point, just about every enterprise will move workloads to the cloud, but unfortunately, there are major gaps in most enterprises' readiness to provide security for cloud-based data. How do you build a database security strategy that works in cloud-based environments and avoid building a business blocker reputation in the process? This session will address several of the main challenges that enterprises face in extending their compliance and security controls. Leading us through this discussion today will be our two speakers, Chris Brown and Bruce Lynch. Chris Brown is Vice President of Strategy at JSonar, where he helps clients evolve their data security strategy in an increasingly complex landscape. Chris brings over 13 years of experience in the database security space, working with a broad range of enterprise clients in the Fortune 1000. He's held previous roles at Guardium, IBM, and Antigua, as well as spending the first half of his career in the semiconductor industry. Bruce Lynch is Product and Content Marketing Manager at Sonar. Prior to joining the company, Bruce was Content Marketing Manager at Scandit Inc. and Cognex Corporation. Before I hand it over to our speakers, a couple of quick notes very quickly. There will be a Q&A session following the official presentation, so be sure to stay tuned for that. And for those interested in slides from the presentation, they can be found in the Resource Center. And so with that, I would now like to welcome in our speakers. Chris and Bruce, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Brad. We're going to get right into this. I want to thank everybody for coming, and let's just get started. So, Chris, I'm going to bring you in right here, and I'm going to ask you if you could please talk about what new challenges does the cloud bring to database security?
Great. Thanks, Bruce, and thanks, Brad. It does bring a much more complex landscape, and the reality is that database security was already hard before some of these new variables and complexities that are introduced by the cloud. I think if you speak to a lot of organizations, they would readily acknowledge that despite making substantial investments in this area, they've predominantly focused on compliance and yet are under a lot of pressure to shift this to more of a data-centric security model. So you've got this foundation of challenges, but as you look specifically at the cloud, what you quickly recognize is that many of the tools that people have relied upon for addressing database security, traditional tools are not really a great fit for a number of different reasons. The skills gap that was already in place around database security becomes more pronounced because there are a lot of new technologies and things are just done differently in the cloud. Obviously, there's a lot more flexibility, but that becomes somewhat of a double-edged sword because that means things move much more rapidly, and there are a lot of new technologies and methods that need to be learned. There's also this notion of database proliferation. In the traditional world, normally for an enterprise, you would have maybe 3 to 5 databases that are your approved standards, and you try and sort of funnel every application into using those 3 to 5. In the cloud world, it could be, we're seeing 3 to 5 go to 10 to 15, and in some cases, 10 to 15 going to 20 to 25. So all of a sudden, the landscape is much more complicated. There's a lot more moving parts. And it's difficult to wrap your arms around all those different changes.
Okay. So now that we've talked a little bit about some of these concerns, what are you learning about what companies are doing to manage their migration to the cloud?
So I think there's a couple of different pieces to this, and we're not going to spend a lot of time going through the mom and apple pie about how database security is hard and data security is hard, and people are losing data all over the place. I think that's pretty well accepted at this point. What we tend to focus on, given our database-centric view of the world, is that because it's difficult and because organizations are struggling with database security, it's actually emerged as an impediment that is slowing companies' workload migrations to the cloud. And we've had plenty of instances where our clients, at the onset of their exploration of JSONAR, have looked at this and said, we're literally preventing workloads from moving to the cloud. And in fact, in one case, I'm familiar with a very large banking organization that has suspended their migration to the cloud, specifically because they're not comfortable with the level of security controls on the cloud side and their equivalence to controls that they've invested years and years and years in building on the traditional on-prem side. So it's very much the case that database security controls are critical towards facilitating and accelerating the migration of workloads into the cloud.
Okay, well, it's huge. I mean, for a large enterprise to slow down or suspend a big project like a cloud migration, that's a huge undertaking. Could you take us into some of the factors that are weighing heavily enough on the minds of security people to compel them to take drastic measures like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we talked about these a little bit in one of the earlier charts, but I can dig down a little bit deeper. As I said, things are just very different. How you access data, how you provision systems, how you manage identity. These are all different in the cloud versus how folks have approached them on-prem. The database diversity that we talked about has become a very big thing, and particularly when you couple traditional on-prem databases and the way that they're accessed versus their counterparts on the cloud side. So it's not only the diversity of the databases, but it's the diversity of how you interact with them. And the combination of the two really compounds these types of problems. The other thing that we're seeing a lot, and it's tied to not only the skills gap, but just the overall economic climate these days, is that the budgets and the teams that are available to facilitate these solutions are increasingly limited. I think everybody in the security world is familiar with the concept of needing to do more with less, because the reality is that over time, organizations have spent tremendous amounts of money on deploying security solutions, and yet still aren't comfortable with the value that they're realizing from these tools. And I can tell you that this is especially true in the database security world, again, because in many cases these tools are quite expensive, and the level of output that you receive from them is quite limited. The other issue that we see is just the speed of change or rate of change in the cloud. In the traditional world, you would stand up a database, and that database may remain in place for a couple of years. So reasonably static, and once it's up and running, you leave it alone for a while. Monitoring's in place, and you go about your business. In the cloud world, database instances may be spun up and torn down in a matter of weeks. And so it's a real stark contrast from an agility standpoint, and the burden that it places on the solutions and the processes to be able to keep up with that level of dynamics within the solution environment.
Okay, so let me ask you this then, Chris. How does an enterprise get from point A, compliance, to point B, which we'll call real database security?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that most organizations are struggling with today. You know, people have been attacking database security now for 20 years. And the challenge has always been how to achieve this effectively. And as I said earlier, most of these programs tend to be oriented towards compliance as opposed to true data security. And what's interesting about compliance is that you know what you're looking for. You tell the system to monitor for this, and as it finds it, it gets recorded, and then you develop a series of reports. From a security visibility perspective, it's very different. You're not quite sure what you're looking for, and so it demands higher levels of visibility, opening monitoring policies up so you can see much more broadly relative to the activities that are taking place. And as is highlighted in this chart, what this results in is an insane number of security events that could be generated, particularly at the database tier, because, you know, think about what's happening at the database layer and the volume of activity that's occurring every second at the database tier is measured in tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of events. So as you make that shift from a compliance-driven focus to a security-driven focus, you're immediately faced with this onslaught of raw security information that you need to make sense of. And so one of the first and most significant barriers that you need to overcome is, what do I do with all this data? Unfortunately, for many organizations today, the answer to that question is I dump it into a repository somewhere, and then I hope that there are some methods for distilling that down into meaningful information that we can respond to. But the reality is that that's not often the case. In many situations, customers tend to declare victory once they get all this data into a repository where they can store this information. But the reality is that's when the work begins, and it's by no means the point at which you declare victory. And so part of your strategy has to be around not only solving the data collection, but then also solving for the interpretation of this data. And that's an area that we see tremendous opportunity for addressing by taking advantage of things like some of the new analytics technologies that have emerged in the marketplace.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how you manage this.
You bet. And so this is a profile that we developed based on our interaction with thousands of customers and trying to understand what their programs look like today versus what they'd like for them to look like moving forward, and what some of the core areas are for them to focus on in order to achieve a much more effective program, number one, and ultimately realize the value out of these types of investments, both from a cost effectiveness perspective, and then also being able to declare a much higher degree of confidence and comfort in the overall security that you've achieved through these programs. And right away, you can see that there's a basic flaw in how these resources have been allocated traditionally on the journey towards database security and compliance. And the flaw is that the overwhelming percentage of time is being invested in the building the foundation of visibility, which is what I alluded to earlier around, how do I ensure that I've captured all of this data and I have it in an area where it can be evaluated, analytically processed, etc. And what we often find is that customers spend so much time on this sort of call it the floor, that it precludes them from having the necessary resources to focus on the higher order contributors. So if you look at this red line, that's generally what we see in the clients that we start working with, where so much energy is focused on that data collection. And of course, we talked earlier about with the advent of the cloud, that data collection tier becomes that much more challenging. So first and foremost, what you need to have is a strategy that focuses on making it much, much easier to collect all of this data and collect it through a policy lens that says, I'm not sure what I'm looking for. So I'm going to open up my policy as wide as I can to be able to see everything that's happening within this environment, because I know that I have facilities downstream to be able to make sense of this. And ultimately, what you want to be able to do is get to the point where you can take for granted that you have all the data that you need to fully characterize what's happening at the database layer from all these different sources. And you have that information available not only for analytical inspection, but for things like forensic inspection, or enabling the operations team within your organization to also view this data. Because once you've established this level of visibility, that information becomes valuable to a number of different stakeholders, not just for compliance purposes or for security purposes. And so as you traverse this stack, you know, the concept of unlocking visibility into this data to empower those different groups. And then also the next and what ultimately becomes the most valuable area that needs to be addressed is how you take advantage of different analytical technologies to convert what can easily be terabytes of raw data a day into a handful of manageable and actionable events. Because at the end of the day, as you institute more effective security controls, that's what you should be left with. You shouldn't be trying to track down, you know, the 300,000 failed login alerts that you received yesterday because there's some random script being executed that you forgot to update the password for. And so there's a terrific opportunity to leverage analytics to do that distillation process for you. And then you know, ultimately the next leg in that becomes, how do I automate all of these different pieces? Because in every one of these processes, there are a variety of process flows that today involve quite a bit of manual effort that's ripe for process automation and some of the techniques that you see being widely adopted today under the banner of SOAR. But in this particular case, it's not SOAR as it relates to event response, but it's SOAR in terms of how do I engage with the application owners? How do I engage with the appropriate DBAs so that they can have direct access to the information that's meaningful to them, to be able to both remediate issues as well as improve their overall security posture of the application and its underlying database.
Great. So let's go on and see how the addition of cloud environments is making this harder and how you can approach it.
Yeah, and so if we look at this chart, you know, it does a nice job depicting the evolution that I described a few minutes ago, and this notion of historically when people talked about database security, they were predominantly talking about database activity monitoring tools and solving audit and logging. In many respects, this got all the attention because this is the sexy part of database security, being able to see what's happening on a real-time basis. But the reality is that audit and logging is only one component of an effective database security strategy. You, of course, need to do discovery and classification so you can understand what it is that you need to be particularly focused on from a data risk perspective. And of course, with things like GDPR and CCPA and some of the other standards that have emerged, this has taken on a much higher level of priority and significance because it's central to understanding your effectiveness around those compliance definitions. Vulnerability assessment, access control, these are also key contributors to this. And what's happening, again, is it was already challenging enough to solve these different pillars, if you will, on a subset of databases. But as you grow and start to incorporate all of these different feeds, this is when you start to run into some of the challenges that I alluded to earlier around traditional tools and traditional processes just not being able to adapt well to the challenges in the cloud world. And some of the ones that I'll highlight are around, obviously there's a never-ending concern on costs and the level of effort that's required to put in place some of these effective processes. Things like agents are just a basic mismatch for the cloud philosophy. There is no concept of let me take a few weeks to install an agent, let me upgrade it over time, let me bring down the server. That's just not a valid concept in the cloud domain. And so you really need a system that's much more agile and eliminates a lot of the traditional impediments that make these tools ill-suited for the cloud world.
Okay. So having sort of gotten a sort of a baseline of what the challenges are and what needs to happen, what if you were going to put together sort of a priority list for creating real database security and creating real database security strategy in cloud-based environments? What sort of things would you encourage people or advise people to ask and talk about? Sure.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of core pieces that you need to consider, and obviously for any initiative, you really have to think through what your strategy is, and what's happening in the with the introduction of cloud, coupled with some of the challenges that people have faced historically around database security, is that you really have to consider from a strategy standpoint the two core components. And the first is, what is the sensor method that you're going to rely upon for capturing this data, because it has changed quite dramatically for the cloud as opposed to traditional on-prem, and you need to give some thought to what makes the most sense from a operational perspective and ease of integration perspective. And that it's really not about how do I collect this raw data and how do I store it somewhere effectively. That's oftentimes people consider that the end goal, but it's the exact opposite of that. It's the beginning point once you have all of this data. And the far more important consideration is, what do I do with this data? How do I interpret this data? How do I reconcile data from all of these different sources so that I can have a cohesive view across my entire estate? And this really ties directly into this notion of compliance is not good enough. We've spent many, many years deploying programs that for which the goal was being able to pass an audit and capture and submit a set of reports that keep the auditors at bay. But that's just no longer a viable target. It certainly doesn't align well with the cost of these investments to achieve that level of visibility. And most executives that I speak with today have had it with sort of this value imbalance between spending millions and millions of dollars only to get approval from an auditor that they've passed for another year, when most people accept the fact that at this point, achieving compliance really is a minimal contributor to the degree to which you've achieved security within the environment. And of course, for you to achieve security, analytics are a given. There's just no way to do this effectively without analytics. There's too much raw data. There's too much of an opportunity, particularly at the database tier, to break down what otherwise is a very, very poor signal-to-noise ratio in terms of the high-value information that you're trying to extract, and apply analytics to make that a reality. And then the fourth point is things are very different. There are new technologies, there are new techniques, there are new strategies, and it's important that you align with partners that can help you get up to speed quickly in terms of understanding what some of those differences are, and in many cases have embedded that new information directly into the platform that they're making available, so that you can very smoothly extend your controls into the cloud world from what you've invested in on-prem now for the last 20 years.
Okay, excellent. So how can JSONAR help?
So having spent many, many years at Guardium and some of the other organizations that are focused specifically around database security, we certainly understand extremely well what the historical challenges have been. In fact, at this point, we would declare that the leadership at JSONAR are the folks that invented database security. And so because we recognized a number of years ago that the entire landscape was changing, we set about to build a platform that would not only address some of the value challenges that traditional DAM customers were facing with their DAM investments, but also pave the way to be able to efficiently and effectively accommodate this wholesale change that was taking place as a function of the introduction of the cloud. And so first and foremost, you have to have facilities in place to be able to capture data from all of these different sources. And you can see in the chart reference to the major cloud providers like Amazon, Google, and Azure. Some of the new databases as a service providers like Snowflake or Mongo Atlas that are cloud agnostic. And then some of the big data solutions that over the past few years have proven to be quite challenging for the traditional solutions. So getting to a point where you're able to capture not only activity information from any database platform, but then also on the far right-hand side, an increasingly critical component, which is the metadata information that, in order for you to be effective, must be accompanied or must be attached through enrichment to the raw data. Otherwise, you're lacking critical context, and as a result, it's very hard to make decisions, both in terms of the risk rating associated with an event, or how do you route a particular event through an automated decision tree to be able to arrive at the correct conclusion. And so construct that layer that allows you to ingest all this different data and then apply to it higher orders of intelligence and abstraction through analytics, through process orchestration and automation, and then ultimately expose this information through a self-service mechanism that enables different teams to gain value from this information. I described this a little bit earlier, where at the end of the day, you want to have a platform that enables all of your different teams to get to this data. And that's really key to not only solving some of the security challenges, but dramatically increasing the level of value that you get from these investments.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. So that's our presentation for today. Some information about how to get a demonstration to see the JSONR platform firsthand and see why Fortune 500 companies trust JSONR to turbocharge security and compliance programs. We invite you to reach out to us and find out more. And I am going to say goodbye. Thank you for coming, and send it back to Brad.
All right. Well, thank you. This is Bradley Barth from SC Media rejoining, and I think we have just enough time for maybe a couple of quick questions. So first question, what can I do to ensure that my company's security controls extend to my cloud-based workloads?
Great question, and the easy answer is that there are a number of different things that are really important considerations. First and foremost, you just have to rethink how you've been doing this, because what you've been doing on-prem is not really sufficient nor applicable because of how different things are in the cloud world. We talked a little bit about the agents are a mismatch in the cloud. The dynamics of the cloud are very different, and so you really have to change or rethink your strategy on the lowest level of the architecture, which is at the sensor stage in terms of how you capture this data, and use that to funnel the raw information into the architecture that serves as the foundation for deriving any value at all from a visibility perspective.
All right, let's take a look at another question here. What about when a company is concerned with sensitive data security in the cloud? What can they do to ensure a cloud vendor can secure sensitive data?
Great question, and really a loaded question for a couple of different reasons. First of all, it's a misnomer to think that the cloud vendor is going to take on a greater share of the responsibility on protecting that sensitive data. The onus remains on the enterprise organization while they're leveraging underlying technologies from the cloud provider to preserve responsibility and focus on that. You read a lot these days about breach examples that came about as a result of S3 buckets, for example, that were unprotected, or a default account and password were left in place. It has to be and continues to be the responsibility of the enterprise to ensure that things like that are not happening. The cloud vendor will help you in a number of different areas, but there's still quite a few controls that have to translate directly from what you had been doing on-prem to how to achieve similar controls on the cloud side.
Great. We're short on time, but we're going to try to address one more really quick. People hear sometimes horror stories about customers of various cloud vendors not enforcing basic internal security practices like password formation and then possibly exposing sensitive data. So what can people do to ensure that their data is protected in that scenario?
Yeah, I think this is sort of the extension of the question just prior, which is around new controls, new exposure that need to be understood, and this is a reflection of how things are different in the cloud, and also some of the skills gaps that we talked about, and the fact that you really do need to develop a more comprehensive program relative to what some of the new gaps are that exist on the cloud side, while at the same time making sure that the traditional gaps and traditional areas of focus are also addressed satisfactorily. So I hate to break it to folks, but it's really true that while the cloud can make things easier in certain areas, on the database security front, it's going to take what was already a difficult challenge and make it more challenging. But the good news is that with the types of capabilities and platform that we've developed, we've incorporated much of the knowledge and insight that's needed to deal with that expanded level of difficulty into the solution that helps minimize some of those challenges.
All right. Well, great. Thanks, Chris. With that, we've run out of time, and today's session has officially concluded. I want to once again thank my presenters today, Chris Brown and Bruce Lynch, for being with us. And, of course, thanks to everyone else for tuning in and listening. As a reminder, this webcast will be available on demand beginning tomorrow on the SC Media website under the Events tab. And again, for those interested in slides from the presentation, they're available in the Resource Center. For SC Media, this has been Bradley Barth. Until next time, have a safe day online.